Today the Allies are conducting negotiations. The radio is spitting speeches, brimming with the tributes our ex-enemies are paying one another. All I know is that we Germans are finished. We're nothing but a colony, subject to their whims. I can't change any of that, I just have to swallow it. All I want to do is steer my little ship through the shoals as best I can. That means hard work and short rations. But the old sun is still in the sky. And maybe my heart will speak to me once more. One thing's for sure, my life has certainly been full. All too full. Thursday, 7th of June, 1945. Today the walking machine had the day off. I got up early to queue at the greengrocer's for some pickled pumpkin. Unfortunately, the stuff proved too briny for me to get down. Luckily, I got 2 bunches of dried vegetables, known as shredded wire, and a bag of dried potatoes. On top of that I picked a handful of nettles in the gardens outside the ruined buildings, elegantly plucking them using the fishnet gloves I saved from my air raid gear. I devoured them greedily, even drinking the greenish stock I'd boiled them in, and felt properly refreshed. After that, I calculated that my period was over 2 weeks late, so I strode 7 buildings down to where a woman doctor had hung her signboard, though I'd never seen her before and didn't even know if she had started practicing again. Once inside, I met a blonde woman, not much older than me, who received me in a wind-battered room. She'd replaced the window panes with old X-rays of unidentified chests. She refused to engage in small talk and got right down to business. "No," she said, after examining me. "I don't see anything. Everything's all right." "But I'm so late. I've never had that before." "Do you have any idea how many women are experiencing the same thing, including me? We're not getting enough to eat, so the body saves energy by not menstruating. You better see that you get a little meat on your bones, then your cycle will get back to normal." She asked for 10 marks, and I handed them to her. But I felt bad. After all, what could she do with that? After we were through, I risked asking whether there were indeed lots of women who'd been raped by the Russians and were now pregnant and coming and asking for her help. "It's better not to speak of such things," she said curtly, showing me out. A quiet evening, all to myself. Gusts of wind are sweeping through the empty window frames, swirling dust into the room. Where can I possibly go if the real tenant shows up one day? What's certain is that, if I hadn't been here, the apartment would long since have been cleared out by the roofers and various other fellow citizens. When it comes to heating, other people's furniture burns better than your own. Friday, 8th of June, 1945. The walking machine is back at it. An amazing event today. A section of the S-Bahn has resumed operations on a trial basis. I saw the red and yellow cars up on the track, climbed the stairs, paid 2 old Groschen for a ticket and got on board. The passengers were sitting on the benches with an air of ceremony. 2 of them immediately moved closer together so I could squeeze in. Then we went hurtling through the sunny wasteland of the city, while all the endless, tedious minutes I had spent marching flew by the window. I was sorry I had to get out as soon as I did. The ride was so nice, a real gift. I put in a lot of work. Ilse and I sketched out the first number of our planned women's magazine. We still haven't decided on a name for it, so we put our heads together on that. Each periodical definitely has to contain the word new. The day was strangely dreamlike. People and things appeared as if behind a veil. I walked back home on sore feet, listless from hunger. All we had to eat at Ilse's was more pea soup, 2 ladlefuls apiece since we're trying to make the supplies last. It seemed to me that every person I passed had hollow, hungry eyes. Tomorrow I'm planning to go and pick some more nettles. I kept my eyes peeled for every spot of green along the way. Everywhere you turn, you can sense the fear. People are worried about their bread, their work, their pay, about the coming day. Bitter, bitter defeat. Saturday, 9th of June, 1945. Day off for me. We agreed that for as long as I don't have anything to eat, I'd make the 12-mile trek only every other day. In the store where I'm registered, they gave me groats and sugar in exchange for coupons, enough for 2 or 3 meals. Then, with my elegantly begloved hands, I picked an entire mountain of nettle shoots, orach, and dandelions. In the afternoon I went to the hairdresser's for the first time in ages and asked for a shampoo and set. They washed about a pound of dirt out of my hair. The hairdresser had popped up from somewhere to take over the shop of a colleague who was pressed into the Volkssturm at the last minute, and is missing in action. Supposedly the man's family was evacuated to Thuringia. The place had been pretty well ransacked, but one mirror is still intact, and one dryer is still halfway serviceable, if rather dented. The man's speech was very pre-war. "Yes, ma'am. Why, of course, ma'am. I'd be happy to, ma'am." I find all the overly solicitous and polite phrases somewhat alien now. "Yes, ma'am," is for internal use only, a currency of no value except among ourselves. To the rest of the world, we're nothing but rubble women and trash. Sunday, 10th of June, 1945. They've announced on the radio that the Russians are going to set up their military administration in Berlin after all, so that Russia will now stretch all the way to Bavaria, Hanover and Holstein. The English are supposed to get the Rhine and Ruhr, and Bavaria goes to the Americans. It's a topsy-turvy world with our country all sliced up. We've had peace for a month now. A reflective morning with music and sunshine, which I spent reading Rilke, Goethe, Hauptmann. The fact that they, too, are also German is some consolation, that they were of our kind. At 1:30 p.m. I set off on a humid march through a Berlin that's still silent and empty. In Charlottenburg we sat down again and planned. A new man has joined our group, a professional printer. He thinks obtaining paper shouldn't be our first order of business, since anyone who has paper is going to hold on to it, and even hide it for fear of confiscation. And if someone were willing to part with some, we have no way to pick it up or place to store it until we can start printing. At the moment our entire fleet consists of 2 bicycles, and that's more than most firms. The printer thinks our primary task should be to acquire a license from the authorities, an official allocation of printing paper. The engineer has already made the rounds of every conceivable German or Russian office and collected a lot of empty promises. He gave a rather depressing account. Only the Hungarian is bursting with optimism. He's a sly dog, no doubt about it. I happened to mention a crate of framed photos that was still in the basement of my former firm, portraits of men who'd received the Knight's Cross that were intended to be handed out as prizes at some ceremony. His eyes grew bright, and he immediately asked, "Pictures? With glass?" "Yes, all framed with glass." "We'll go and get the glass," he decreed. He's found some potential office space, but like most spaces in Berlin, it has no window panes. As far as I'm concerned, he can go ahead and break in. I'll gladly act as a lookout. But my guess is that the crater's long since gone. On my way home I dropped in on Gisela. Herta was lying sick on the sofa again, but this time her face was no longer a glowing red, it was snow-white. She'd had a miscarriage, Gisela told me. I didn't ask any questions, just gave each of the girls one of the chocolates the Hungarian had given me on my way out, as a thank you for the good tip about the glass. Filled mocha beans, very tasty. It was nice to see the girls' tense, bitter faces relax up when they tasted the sweet filling. I told Gisela about our publishing plans, thinking that she could join us as soon as one of them becomes concrete. Gisela was sceptical. She can't imagine that we'll be able to print the kind of thing we want to, not here in Germany right now. She thinks that they won't allow anything that doesn't follow the Moscow line, which isn't her own. She's too embarrassed to mention the word God in front of me, but that was the gist of what she was saying. I'm convinced that she prays and that this gives her strength. She doesn't have any more to eat than I do. She has deep circles under her eyes, but hers are lit up, whereas mine are simply bright. We can't help each other now, but the simple fact that I'm surrounded by other hungry people keeps me going. Monday, 11th of June, 1945. Another day to myself. I went to the police to try to get some kind of official permission to use the abandoned garden in the back of the burned-down house where Professor K, a close colleague of mine, used to live. I showed them a letter the old man had sent me from the Brandenburg Mark, where he had found refuge, asking me to look after his garden. I was sent from pillar to post. Nobody claimed to have the authority. Dingy cubbies with cardboard in the windows, musty smells, low-level bickering. Nothing has changed. On the way home I picked my quota of nettles. I was very low on energy. My diet has no fat. There's always this kind of wavy mist in front of my eyes, and I feel a floating sensation, as if I were getting lighter and lighter. Even writing this down takes effort, but at least it's some consolation in my loneliness, a kind of conversation, a chance to pour my heart out. The widow told me she's still having wild dreams of Russians. I haven't had anything like that, probably because I've spewed everything onto paper. My potato supply looks pretty grim. The rations they've given us have to last through to the end of July. We were forced to take them now, and anybody can smell the reason why. The tubers, which had just been dug out of the pit, are fermenting, so that half the potatoes are already a stinking mash. I can hardly stand the smell in the kitchen, but I'm afraid they'll spoil even more quickly if I keep them on the balcony. What are we supposed to live on come July? What's more, I'm worried about the gas stove. When there's enough pressure in the gas line to use it, the pipes start banging like gunshots. And the electric cooker, patched up as it is, doesn't want to run any more. I have to guard the bread against myself. I'm already 100 grams into my next day's ration. I can't let that become a habit. Tuesday, 12th of June, 1945. The automatic walking machine was back to Charlottenburg. No more joyrides on the S-Bahn. Something went wrong after the first few runs, and the trams are once again out of commission. We worked hard. Now our designs and proposals must be submitted to all the various offices. On the way I had a new experience. Bodies were being exhumed from a grassy lawn, to be reinterred in a cemetery. One corpse was already lying on top of all the debris, a long bundle wrapped in sailcloth and caked in loam. The man who was doing the digging, an older civilian, was wiping the sweat off with his shirt sleeves and fanning himself with his cap. It was the first time I had ever smelled a human corpse. The descriptions I've read always use the phrase sweetish odour, but that's far too vague, completely inadequate. The fumes are not so much an odour as something firmer, something thicker, a soupy vapour that collects in front of your face and nostrils, too mouldy and thick to breathe. It beats you back as if with fists. At the moment, the whole city of Berlin is reeking. Typhus is going around, and hardly anyone has escaped dysentery. Herr Pauli was hard hit. I also heard that they came for the lady with eczema. Apparently she's been quarantined in a typhus barracks. There are fields of rubbish all over, swarming with flies. Flies upon flies, blue, black and fat. Must be the life for them. Each bit of faeces is covered with a humming, swarming mass of black. The widow heard a rumour that's going around Berlin. They're making us starve as punishment because a few men from Operation Werewolf recently shot at some Russians. I don't believe it. You hardly see any Russians at all in our district, so the werewolves wouldn't have anyone to prey on. I have no idea where all the Ivans have disappeared to. The widow claims that one of the two drink-and-be-merry sisters who moved to our building, Anya with the cute little son, is still receiving Russian callers with packages. I'm not so sure that's a good thing. I can picture her lying across her sofa, her white throat slit. Scribbled in the margin at the end of June. Not Anya, and not the throat, but a certain Inga, 2 buildings down, was found this morning with her skull bashed in, after a night of boozing with 4 unknown men still at large. She was beaten with a beer bottle, empty, of course. Probably it wasn't malice, or even a lust for murder. More likely it just happened that way, perhaps after an argument over whose turn it was. Or maybe Inga laughed at her visitors. Russians are dangerous when drunk. They see red, fly into a rage against anyone and everyone else when provoked.
End of Side 9. Side 10.
Wednesday, 13th of June, 1945. A day to myself. The widow and I went out to look for nettles and orich, and roamed through the professor's ruined garden, now run wild. Even if I did receive permission to tend the garden, I would be too late. Strangers have broken off whole branches of the cherry tree, picking the cherries just barely turned gold. Nothing will ripen here. Hungry people will harvest everything before its time. Cold, storms and rain. The tram drove down our street again for the first time. I jumped on right away, just for the ride, but once on board I realised that it would be a good time to go to the town hall and ask whether we really could expect pay for our week's labour for the Russians. It turned out my name was indeed on the list, along with all the others, with every workday neatly recorded. They'd even entered the amounts to be withheld for tax. I am to be paid 56 marks, though not until there's money in the coffers again. The clerk asked me to check again next week. At any rate, they're keeping the books, and adding amounts and collecting the money, so I'm bound to get something. While I waited in the rain for the tram to take me back, I spoke with 2 refugees, a married couple. They'd been travelling for 18 days from Czech territory and had bad things to report. The man told how the Czech at the border was stripping Germans of their shirts and hitting them with dog whips. "We can't complain," his wife said wearily. "We brought it on ourselves." Apparently all the roads from the east are swarming with refugees. On the way home I saw people coming out of a cinema. I immediately got off and went into the half-empty auditorium for the next showing. A Russian film entitled At 6 p.m. After the War. A strange feeling, after all the pulp novels I've been living, to sit in the audience and watch a film. There were still soldiers in the audience, alongside several dozen Germans, mostly children. Hardly any women, though. They're still reluctant to venture into dark places with all the uniforms. But none of the men paid any attention to us civilians. They were all watching the screen and laughing diligently. I devoured the film, which was bursting with salt-of-the-earth characters, sturdy women, healthy men. It was a talking movie in Russian. I understood quite a bit, since it takes place among simple people. The film had a happy end, victory fireworks over the turrets of Moscow, though it was apparently filmed in 1944. Our leaders never risked anything like that, for all their promises of future triumphs. Once again, I feel oppressed by our German disaster. I came out of the cinema deeply saddened, but helped myself by summoning things that dull my emotions. Like that bit of Shakespeare I jotted in my notebook back then in Paris, when I discovered Spengler and felt so dejected by his Decline of the West. A tale told by an idiot, full of sound and fury, signifying nothing. Losing 2 world wars hits damned deep. Thursday, 14th of June, 1945. And once again the walking machine was back in Charlottenburg. If only our firm were already in operation and I had my Group 2 ration card with 500 grams of bread per day so that I could save a little of it for the evening. As it is, I sacrifice all 6 of the rye rolls I get every morning for breakfast. That is to say, I pack 2 with me and eat them at the 2 breaks I allow myself, otherwise I'd give out. Despite my frying them in coffee substitute, the rancid-tasting potatoes are difficult to get down. I should pick them over again. The little pile is melting away at an alarming rate. Dozens of telephones were lining the hallway outside the engineer's apartment. They're being collected from everywhere, supposedly for the Russians. Berlin, without phones? Looks like we'll go back to being cavemen. The evening brought a nice surprise. I finally procured my ration of fat for the past 20 days at the corner shop. 20 times 7 equals 140 grams of sunflower oil. Reverently I carried back home the little bottle I'd been toting around all week in vain. Now my apartment smells like a Moscow Stolovia, one of those cafeterias for ordinary people. Friday, 15th of June, 1945. I went down very early to get my 6 daily rolls. They're dark and wet. We never had anything like them before. I no longer dare buy a whole loaf, because I'd eat up the next day's portion. Today we broke into my old employer's basement. The Hungarian, the engineer and I slipped in through the back, through the laundry room. We had managed to prise open the crate, which was standing untouched in the shed, when the wife of the company's representative appeared on the basement stairs. They're still living in the building. I mumbled something about having left some files and papers lying around. The men hid behind the crate. Then we broke off the frames, tore out the pictures, photographs signed by young men decorated with the Knight's Cross, and stacked the glass panes. We'd brought some packing paper and string with us. After that we were able to make our getaway through the back entrance. I don't really care if they noticed the loss. After all, I lost my camera and all my equipment, which I had left at work at my boss's request when the place was destroyed by a bomb. What are a few panes of glass compared with that? We absconded with our loot as fast as we could, each of us lugging a heavy stack of glass to my place, where the men had parked our 2 valuable company bicycles. I was given 4 panes as commission. I could have glazed one whole window in my attic apartment, if I'd had any putty. In the evening I read some of the rather random selection of books belonging to the apartment's rightful tenant. I found a copy of Tolstoy's Polikushka and read that for the umpteenth time. Then I ploughed through a collection of plays by Aeschylus and came across The Persians, which, with its lamentations of the vanquished, seems well suited to our defeat. But in reality it's not. Our German calamity has a bitter taste of repulsion, sickness, insanity, unlike anything in history. The radio just broadcast another concentration camp report. The most horrific thing is the order and the thrift. Millions of human beings, as fertilizer, mattress stuffing, soft soap, felt mats. Aeschylus never saw anything like that. From Saturday, 16th of June, to Friday, 22nd of June, 1945. I haven't been writing. And I won't be either. That time is over. It was around 5 p.m. on Saturday when the doorbell rang. The widow, I thought to myself. But it was Gerd, in civilian dress, sun-tanned, his hair lighter than ever. For a long time neither of us said a thing. We just stared at each other in the dim hallway like 2 ghosts. "Where have you come from? Have you been discharged?" "No, I just sneaked off. But now, would you let me in?" He was dragging a sled behind him, mounted on small wheels and loaded with a trunk and a sack. I was feverish with joy. No, Gerd wasn't coming from the Western Front. His anti-aircraft unit had been shipped out to the east at the last minute. After an enemy shell hit their position, 3 of them went off and parked themselves in an abandoned villa, where they found suits, shoes, a bale of tobacco, and sufficient food. The situation got dicey, though, when the local authorities, a mixture of Russians and Poles, started going through the houses. The three joined a group of Berlin evacuees and marched home with them. Gerd knew my current address from the red-bordered field post he received about my apartment being hit. Of course, he fully expected to find my new lodgings destroyed as well, and me who knows where. He's amazed I'm here, and in one piece. When I told him about my starvation rations, he shook his head, and claimed that from here on he'd take care of getting what was needed. He had some potatoes in his sack, in perfect condition, and a piece of bacon. I started cooking it immediately, and invited the widow to join us. She knows Gerd from my stories, greeted him with an effusive hug, even though she'd never seen him before, and in her torrent of words was soon showing him her thumb and finger trick. Ukrainian woman, like this, you, like this. I could see Gerd was taken aback. With every sentence he grew colder, pretending to be tired. We tiptoed around each other, and were sparing with any words of affection. It's bad that Gerd doesn't have anything to smoke. He had expected a flourishing black market like Berlin of old. After the unaccustomed rich food, I felt flustered and high-spirited. But in the night I found myself cold as ice in Gerd's arms, and was glad when he left off. For him, I've been spoiled, once and for all. Disrupted days, restless nights. All sorts of people who were on the march with Gerd came by, and that led to constant friction. He wanted the guests to be fed. I wanted to save as much bacon and potatoes as I could for the two of us. If I sat there and didn't speak, he yelled at me. If I was in a good mood and told stories about our experiences over the past few weeks, then he really got angry. Gerd, you've all turned into a bunch of shameless bitches, every one of you in the building. Don't you realise? He grimaced in disgust. It's horrible being around you. You've lost all sense of measure. And what was I supposed to say to that? I crawled off in a corner to sulk. I couldn't cry. It all seemed so senseless to me. So stupid. Do you remember, Gerd? It was a Tuesday towards the end of August 1939, around 10 in the morning. You called me at work and asked me to take the rest of the day off, to go on an outing with you. I was puzzled and asked, why? What for? You mumbled something about having to leave and again insisted, come, please come. So we went out to the mark and roamed through the piney woods in the middle of a working day. It was hot. One could smell the resin. We wandered around a lake in the woods and came across whole clouds of butterflies. You identified them by name: common blues, brimstones, coppers, peacocks, swallowtails, and a whole gamut of others. One huge butterfly was sunning itself in the middle of the path, quivering slightly with outspread wings. You called it a morning cloak, velvet brown with yellow and blue seams. And a little later, when we were resting on a tree trunk, and you were playing with my fingers, so quietly, I asked you, do you have a draft notice in your pocket? You said, not in my pocket. But you had received it that morning, and we sensed it meant war. We spent the night in a remote forest inn. 3 days later you were gone, and the war was here. We've both survived it. But is that a good thing for us? I gave Gerd my diaries. There are 3 notebooks full. He sat down with them for a while, and then returned them to me, saying he couldn't find his way through my scribbling and the notes stuck inside with all the shorthand and abbreviations. For example, what's that supposed to mean? He asked, pointing to Shdg. I had to laugh. Schändung, of course. Rape. He looked at me as if I were out of my mind, but said nothing more. Yesterday he left again. He decided to go off with one of his anti-aircraft buddies to visit that man's parents in Pomerania. He said he'll bring back some food. I don't know if he's coming back at all. It's bad, but I feel relieved. I couldn't bear his constant craving for alcohol and tobacco. What else? Our publishing plans are stalled. We're waiting for an official reply. The Hungarian is showing the first signs of growing tired. Lately he's been talking about a political cabaret that absolutely ought to be started up right now. Nonetheless, we continue working diligently on our programme and do what we can to combat our general sense of paralysis. I'm convinced that other little groups of people are starting to move here and there, but in this city of islands we know nothing about each other. Politically, things are slowly beginning to happen. The émigrés who came back from Moscow are making themselves felt. They have all the key positions. You can't tell much from the newspapers, assuming you can even find one. I usually read the Rundschau on the board next to the cinema, where it's stuck up with drawing pins for the general public. Our local district administration has a curious programme. Apparently they're trying to distance themselves from the Soviet economic system. They call themselves democratic and are endeavouring to get all anti-fascists to come together. For a week now, it's been rumoured that the southern parts of Berlin will be occupied by the Americans and the western parts by the English. The widow, duly illuminated by Herr Pauli, thinks that an economic upswing is near at hand. I don't know. I'm afraid it won't matter much which of the Allies will be in charge, now that the victors have embraced so warmly at the Elbe. We'll wait and see. I'm not so easily shaken anymore. Sometimes I wonder why I'm not suffering more because of the rift with Gerd, who used to mean everything to me. Maybe hunger always dulls emotions. I have so much to do. I have to find a flint lighter for the stove. The matches are all gone. I have to mop up the rain puddles in the apartment. The roof is leaking again. They merely patched it up with a few old boards. I have to run around and look for some greens along the street curbs and queue for groats. I don't have feeding time for my soul. Yesterday I experienced something comic. A cart stopped outside our house with an old horse in front, nothing but skin and bones. 4-year-old Lutz Lehmann came walking up holding his mother's hand, stopped beside the cart and asked in a dreamy voice, "Mutti, can we eat the horse?" God knows what we'll all end up eating. I think I'm far from any life-threatening extreme, but I don't really know how far. I only know that I want to survive, against all sense and reason, just like an animal. Does Gerd still think of me? Maybe we'll find our way back to each other yet. Afterword, by the German editor. It is perhaps no accident that an extraordinary work like A Woman in Berlin had a history that is no less amazing. First published in 1953, the book disappeared from view, lingering in obscurity for decades before it slowly re-emerged, was reissued, and then became an international phenomenon, a full half-century after it was written. While we cannot know whether the author kept the diary with eventual publication in mind, it's clear that the private scribblings she jotted down in 3 notebooks and on a few hastily added slips of paper served primarily to help her maintain a remnant of sanity in a world of havoc and moral breakdown. The earliest entries were literally notes from the underground, recorded in a basement where the author sought shelter from air raids, artillery fire, looters, and ultimately rape by the victorious Russians. With nothing but a pencil stub, writing by candlelight since Berlin had no electricity, she recorded her observations. Months later, when a more permanent order was restored, she was able to copy and edit her notes on 121 pages of grey, war-issue paper. The author chose to remain anonymous, and I feel bound to respect her wish, responsible as I am for the reissue of her text. What may be said, however, is that the woman who wrote this book was not an amateur, but an experienced journalist. This is made clear in the diary itself when the author alludes to several trips abroad as a roving reporter. On one occasion she actually travelled to the Soviet Union, where she picked up a basic knowledge of Russian. We may surmise that she continued working for a publishing firm or for various periodicals after Hitler came to power. Up until 1943-44, a number of magazines managed to avoid direct involvement in the relentless propaganda demanded by Joseph Goebbels. It is likely that through her professional contacts the author met Kurt W. Marek, a journalist and critic who facilitated publication of the diary. An editor at one of the first newspapers to appear in the new German state, he went on to work for Revolt, a major Hamburg publishing house. It was to Marek that the author entrusted her manuscript, taking care to change the names of people in the book and eliminate certain revealing details. In 1954, Marek succeeded in placing the book with a publisher in the United States, where he had settled. Thus, A Woman in Berlin first appeared in English, and then in Norwegian, Italian, Danish, Japanese, Spanish, French, and Finnish. It took 5 more years for the German original to find a publisher, and even then Kosodo was not in Germany but in Switzerland. But German readers were obviously not ready to face some uncomfortable truths, and the book was met with hostility and silence. One of the few critics who reviewed it complained about what he called the author's shameless immorality. German women were not supposed to talk about the reality of rape, and German men preferred not to be seen as impotent onlookers when the victorious Russians claimed their spoils of war. The author's attitude was an aggravating factor, devoid of self-pity, with a clear-eyed view of her compatriots' behaviour before and after the Nazi regime's collapse. Everything she wrote flew in the face of the reigning post-war complacency and amnesia. No wonder, then, that the book was quickly relegated to obscurity. By the 70s, the political climate in Germany had become more receptive, and photocopies of the text, which had long been out of print, began to circulate in Berlin. They were read by the radical students of 1968 and taken up by the burgeoning women's movement. By 1985, when I started my own publishing venture, I thought it was high time to reprint A Woman in Berlin, but the project turned out to be fraught with difficulty. The anonymous author could not be traced, the original publisher had disappeared, and it was not clear who held the copyright. Kurt Marek had died in 1971. On a hunch, I contacted his widow, Hannelore, who knew the identity of the author. She also knew that the diarist did not wish to see her book reprinted in Germany while she was alive, an understandable reaction, given the dismal way it was originally received. In 2001, Ms. Marek told me that the author had died, and her book could now reappear. By then, Germany and Europe had undergone fundamental changes, and all manner of repressed memories were re-emerging. It was now possible to raise issues that had long been taboo. Subjects like the widespread collaboration in France, the Netherlands and elsewhere, anti-Semitism in Poland, the saturation bombing of civilian populations, ethnic cleansing in post-war Europe, which for many years had been dwarfed by the German act of genocide, were now legitimate areas of inquiry. These are, of course, complex and morally ambiguous topics, easily exploited by revisionists of all stripes. Nonetheless, they belong on the historical agenda and deserve level-headed discussion. And it is in this context that A Woman in Berlin ought to be read. Hans Magnus Enzensberger, Eichborn. That was A Woman in Berlin, Diary 20th of April 1945 to 22nd of June 1945, by Anonymous, and was read by Diana Bishop. We do hope you have enjoyed listening to this Oak Hill audiobook. If you would like to listen to further titles, please contact your local library or write to us at the address on the box cover.